been asked to talk about arts and rehabilitation in prisons. I'm going to tie that specifically to stories. Everyone has a story in order to create meaning in their life, so here's mine very briefly. In 2004, I had a girlfriend in California. I was doing some master's work in the UK and I wanted an excuse to get to the States. And I looked at the San Quentin Prison Museum. My background is art history, and I was doing a museum studies graduate program. And when I hit the West Coast, I was as disgusted as Bert was when he first encountered the statistics, the realities. I was more affronted that I've been to and fro into, one of the most liberal places in the US, and the prisons issue, mass incarceration, had never fallen on my radar. And I was like, if I've not heard of it, and I like to think I'm keeping abreast of things, then how's the other 350 million people in America doing? A few years passed and I did some work in photo research, and then in 2008 I realised that maybe I had a take on photography that could add to the conversation. There's plenty of activists, plenty of journalists doing really good work on the problems we have now after 40 years of bad policy. But in photography, in this world, there's a belief that maybe images can change minds, can change attitudes, maybe even change society. I was like, well, let's put that to the test with prisons, closed systems that often work, if not to completely shut down image making, certainly work to obscure it or manipulate it. I think it's really funny that today we've had speakers who open their presentations with 5 minutes of statistics. We all have those same statistics. We have to go through those with any audience to explain why we do what we do. Well, I'm lucky I deal in images, so I've got photographs of what it looks to be, what this country has as its architecture and landscape of mass incarceration. 2 years ago, these pictures didn't exist. These were made by Josh Begley, an artist based in Chicago. And he knows how to code. He went to NYU and he adapted some Google code and fed into it the coordinates of 5,300 locked facilities in the US. And he ran the code, he ran the program, and it automatically captured every single prison, jail, private prison, immigration detention facility. And you just start to see patterns. You start to see that we don't build prisons in cities and towns anymore. We build them where they're hidden, they're invisible, they're strategically obscured, they're in high deserts, and they're also used to support small towns in post-industrial America. So for 5 years now, I've been looking at imagery. I think I've got to the point where I'm very interested in what imagery prisoners have some sort of agency in making, but I will look at everything. I'll look at surveillance, I'll look at stuff that's used in class action lawsuits, I'll look at mugshots that are used online for entertainment, and then also for routine public humiliation. There's a strange trend towards that, but I've heard there's lawsuits going on to inhibit those that profit from routine public humiliation of our felons, and that's how images play into this wider net that it's impossible to escape from once you've been branded a felon. This is our, if you punch in prison to Google, this is what you get, which doesn't really tell us anything at all. We have clip art, we have hand sweep bars, but I noticed that was your first slide. If you punch in prisoner, it gets even worse. And I think this is indicative of a country that turns away from any understanding of its incarcerated class, and I'm going to be blunt, has no problem joking about sexual predation and rape in prisons. Like, what's wrong with us? Do we have people in our society that they deserve it? Usually in my lectures, I spend half an hour talking about the history of documenting prisons in this country. I'm going to do it today with one picture. prior to, say, the 1950s, all the prison photography was street crime photography, mug shots, noir stuff, very cinematic. In the 1960s and 1970s, some clever individual photographers started to realize that prison issues could be tied directly to social justice and social inequality, and also the civil rights. And they started in the prisons in the South and in Texas, and they moved slowly throughout the country as the country built more and more prisons. I want to talk to you today about how photography can be used by prisoners, how prisoners can be involved in the making of images, and maybe, I'll put it out there as a premise, that these are the type of images we should be looking at, and these are the type of images that inform us about prisons, okay? So we have amazing individual programs across the states which are providing direct services, but my job, I guess, is to try and convince the public as a whole that things are far more nuanced than the stereotypes that we've been fed for too long. So this is Morikami. He grew up just like 20 miles north of San Quentin, and he watched through the 80s how California's prison population just grew. He stayed away from bare chests and tattoos, and he looked at civilian clothing, and then also when he published a book, he put in the writings of the prisoners who were his subjects. It was the first time, I think, there was some sort of collaboration happening. Deborah Looster, if there's anyone around who would probably have every reason to hate prisoners, it's probably Deborah. Her mother was killed by a contract killer. And only a few years after that, having picked up a camera to help her through her own rehabilitation, she happened upon the topic of prisons in Louisiana. She literally went and knocked on a gate, and the warden was like, yeah, come back Monday. So over a period of 5 years, she worked in 3 prisons in Louisiana. She worked frantically. She says she estimates 25,000 images. She gave away 15,000 prints. Those prints were used by prisoners to send to their families. There was a lady who hadn't seen her kids in years, and she had 6 grown children, and 3 of them, having received these prints, were compelled to go visit their mother after years of non-communication. I just pulled this off the internet. I Googled psychology, storytelling, good mental health. But I think it could be essential for prisoners. There's a lot of creative writing classes out there. There's a lot of painting classes. But using a camera creates a different type of problem, right? A camera is a security tool in a prison. It's used to surveil and control and discipline, whereas getting a pencil or a paintbrush into a prison is a lot easier. But I'm playing with the idea that maybe camera workshops in prisons could play a part in telling stories. Club de Sluban has done it across the world for many, many years. Moldova, Ireland, Guatemala, almost 10 countries. Jails are a world to be discovered. He's primarily working with juveniles. Cosmin Bumba did a 6-week workshop in a women's prison in Romania. Vance Jacobs did a similar workshop, mounted the exhibition in the prison and in a cultural centre at the same time. How am I doing for time? Any questions? Is everyone okay? Michael Subotsky, very, very famous young photojournalist. Everyone loves him. Also very humble. He created a award-winning series from South Africa's prisons. But he's a white South African, and he's pretty uncomfortable with what he found, which was that the inequalities of the apartheid era had remained the same, if not got more pronounced, in the country's prisons. He went back and did a photography workshop, and this is a photograph by one of his students. But it's not something he talks about, and I think it's because he hasn't resolved what the outcomes of the program was. I would love to find out, good or bad. With the growth of prisons in this country, the weight, the importance that was put on images grew. This is my theory. And so press access wasn't as freely granted, and control was implemented more and more. So you can witness a change in the type of imagery you see coming out of prisons over the past few decades. But prisoners had a moment where they had cameras and could make images. In the 1970s in New York, in 8 prisons, there was a program run by the Floating Foundation of Photography. And next week I'm going to go visit Karen. Karen's still in DC. She's currently making a documentary film about her 7 years teaching a photography program in Washington, DC. She had no idea at the time that it was a pioneering program, that she was the only one, and that it would be the last photography workshop delivered in an adult male prison in this country. I'm hoping one day I'll give this presentation and someone will correct me on that, because 1988 is 25 years ago now. In juvenile facilities, we have people like Steve Davis. This is the Intense Management Unit, the IMU at Green Hill in Washington State. This is the most locked down architecture of any prison in Washington State. It's not set up. These 4 men can't see each other, they can't hear each other. Steve went into this unit and he was setting up his equipment, and his assistant tapped him on the shoulder and told him to turn around. When he turned around, this is what he saw. It still took him 5 or 10 minutes to get his camera set up and ready. Those guys didn't move. 23-hour-a-day lockdown for those men. Sorry, boys, I should be very clear. Steve also worked with the girls for anonymity purposes. He chose to do a pinhole photography workshop. So I don't know if it's clear what's happening here. These are origami pieces at the bottom. I think it's a double exposure, certainly long exposure. And at the top, the girls are reenacting search or restraint positions that they would take routinely between the cells and the yard. And I wish I could show you more pictures. The series is very, very powerful, and when I published it, created a lot of interest. With the boys, things were a lot more looser. Steve did photography workshops in 2 places, Maple Lane, and I forget the name of the other. And in between the weekly classes, the boys were actually allowed to have cameras, during their free time. Steve has told me that at moments the guards confiscate the cameras as a point of discipline. And I've recently exhibited these in a show, in an exhibition, because I wonder whether these are showing us more than the average photographer's images would. Okay? The reason I'm moving towards this type of non-named photographer imagery is because if a photographer gets into a prison, they're not there because they busted down the gate, they're there because the administration invited them in. So there's always a suspicion or the argument that the photographer is an extension of the prison's power. These photographs just show boys being boys and also making terrible fashion choices. They've got time on their hands to set up a moment like this. And then, don't worry, this young lad is fine. One of the prompts was vulnerability, and this is indicative of the type of photographs that came back. As far as I can tell, there are 2 programs that function currently in the United States in juvenile facilities. One is at the Rhode Island Training School, run by AS220. It's a marvelous organization in as much that it has programs in the community, it has after-school programs and care, it has studios, advanced studios for video and music for kids to use. And if and when these kids get released, they walk them by the hand from the programs we provided in the juvenile detention facility into similar programs in the community. It's a very comprehensive type of take on the issue. And the quality of the work is fantastic. I exhibited this work in Belgrade, before Christmas, and they loved it. By the way, everyone in Europe, particularly Eastern Europe and Russia, is very fascinated by American prisons. They welcomed the exhibition wholeheartedly. And the exhibition in Belgrade was specifically about children, and they couldn't really fathom how brutal we were towards our children. The other project is the Fresh Eyes project in New Mexico. I think it's younger and it's certainly less sophisticated. It's more a case of putting digital cameras in the hands of kids. But I'm going to visit New Mexico in the summer and ask them some tough questions and see where they're going. Again, in my Google search for psychology and storytelling, I got this back. I'll read it off the screen, it's easier. Amongst 47 adults who previously hadn't been asked to do extended journaling, and this is common sense, the results indicated that those that did took some agency. They took agency of their own life and of their own story. And I think that probably runs through all successful re-entry programs and rehabilitation programs. My question is, that I'm working on, is does photography have a role in telling a visual story, your own narrative, and what possibilities exist within the prison to make images that are relevant and helpful to you when you're telling sort of like a longer arc of a tale over your lifetime. This is work by Robert Gumpert. If he only made portraits, I wouldn't be interested. But he's a big fan of radio, and that audio is the key part of his project. He has a very simple transaction that he proposes when he goes into the San Francisco jails, which he has been doing for 9 years, and that's, I will make your portrait, I'll give you prints and a CD with those prints on it. In return, I would love a story. He doesn't even ask them questions. If you ask Bob what he is, he's not a journalist, he's not an activist, he's an enthusiast for storytelling. So as much as he can unmediate, remove himself from the process, he does that. And this project can only exist on the web because it's portraits and audio, and it's there for perpetuity for us all to appreciate. But it gives, as far as I can see, a very unedited and I'm shy to use the word pure, but less manhandled depiction of prisoners in the US. I'm almost done. How am I doing for time? How am I over? I've got to kill it. I'll kill it with this picture, actually. Is everyone familiar with TAMS, the Supermax facility in Illinois? Yeah. It doesn't exist anymore. Hey. It did exist for 14 years. TAMS was opened in 98, 99, and the administration at the time explained that it was a management facility, and the worst of the worst would be extracted from the other prisons in Illinois and put into this new, shiny new Supermax in order to discipline them and crack down and disrupt gang activity, and anyone would only be held for no more than a year. What's interesting about that is that the UN reporter on torture says that anything more than 15 days in solitary is psychological torture and against the UN mandate. But America is exceptional in all its correctional practices and has 80,000 people every day in solitary lockdown. So on the 10-year anniversary of TAM's opening, a group of activists and photographers pushed together and they decided that they would start protesting. And one of the projects they did was photo requests from solitary. And so the reason this is a good point to end on is because the project served the men inside, but then it went out into the world and it served the public in terms of education. The question was, if you could have one photo on your wall, what would it be? And remember, in some of these cases, these men were banned from having anything in the cells beyond the very, very basics. Easy enough question, right? practice wasn't so easy. The state wouldn't tell them who was locked up in this facility, so they did freedom of information. They got the names of about 200 men. They sent the question, and they got 75 back. Then activists and photographers went out into the world and made the images. They were a very, very visually strange mixture. There was rearing horses with hot breath in the cold air. There was clowns writing long love letters. There was a lot of requests for nature. There was a request for Jennifer Lopez's bottom. But he was very specific. He said it had to be that time she was on that boat dating Ben Affleck. So, you know, the political agency of these guys differed. This guy knew exactly what he was doing. This is Bald Knob Cross, and I think it's the second tallest cross structure, certainly in America. It can't be in the world, I don't know. It's somewhere in southern Illinois. And this guy was a man of faith, and he said, I would like a photograph of all you people doing this great activism work to help us in prayer at the bottom of this cross. So Rachel Herman, who was with the group, made this image. What the guy was this is a symbol. What the guy was actually doing was he's saying, come together as a community and share a moment. The Tangier 10 Project were one of the groups that was instrumental in changing public opinion in Illinois and shutting down that Supermax prison. The guys have moved to other facilities, and some of their conditions have not improved, but it's a big step forward. The organizer of this project also is very keen to point out that the governor, I think his name was Pat Quinn at the time, also helped along the way. There was the political will also. This exhibit has travelled and it's raced through photo circles, and every time it's exhibited on walls, there's people stood in front of these images explaining not what's in the images, but what's in the prisons in our own country. And so, in a general visual landscape that's obscured and manipulated and beaten, this project, I think, works on so many levels. And I've got a million other projects I could show you, but we need to stop, so there we go.